Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Words to Work book club presented by the Office for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and the Center for Race, Indigeneity, Disability, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. I'm Jacob Ortel, also known as Kobe Ortel, the program coordinator for Ridges. This book club series is meant to bring people together from all corners of CLA, including undergraduate students, graduate students, faculty, staff, and alumni. In order to read powerful texts together, apply their learning to their work, and share their insights with the university community. Thank you all again for joining us. I will now let the members of this book club introduce themselves.
Thank you, Kobe, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm Isha Kunduri, and I'm a graduate student at the College of Liberal Arts. I'm at the University of Minnesota, which I acknowledge is on Dakota land. And I work broadly on caste gender intersections among marginalized workers in India. And my intention to be part of this book club is to engage with broader caste race conversations. And also I've been part of DEI commitments at the university. So thank you once again for being here.
Good morning, everyone. I also just want to start by acknowledging that we are doing this on the traditional and contemporary lands of the Dakota peoples. We are also doing this in the city that murdered George Floyd, a city that also has tremendous racial disparities that need to be contended with. My name is Melinda Lindquist. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the College of Liberal Arts. I'm also a faculty member in the History Department, where I'm an associate professor, and I work in African American gender history, intellectual history. It was wonderful reading this book because I got to engage with social scientists and scholars that I frequently engage with in my own scholarship. And the intention I bring to this space is really just to be fully present and engaged with the members of the book club that I have come to know and enjoyed being in conversation with, and to extend that conversation now out further into the community. So welcome, everyone.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Laura Lepke, she, her pronouns. I also want to acknowledge that we are joining from the University of Minnesota. Here on the unceded lands of the Dakota. My role at the university right now is as staff. I am the Associate Director of Graduate Studies for the Department of Psychology, but I am also an alum. Got my PhD from the History Department, in which Melinda works. So it's continuing ties between departments is, I think, one of the things that's really important about this experience and this discussion is the chance to reconnect. For me, in terms of intentions, I'm here to learn, to build connections, my own capacity for change and transformation that, both personal as well as institutional. So thanks again for joining us, everyone.
All right, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? I switched to my AirPods just so I could hear better. Okay, great. Good morning, everyone. My name is Stephanie M. Gandy. I use she, her pronouns. I am also on the University of Minnesota campus, which is located on the indigenous homelands of the Dakota people. And as Melinda said, we also acknowledge the labor that our institution had in involvement with the institution of slavery, early established in this country and before it. That also ties with a little bit of our book, but acknowledging both that and then this, deep history of police aggression that we have in our area with too many names that have made national news. Recently we've had several. I think we're coming up on the year anniversary of Amir Locke. So I think we have a lot of people that we unfortunately can name, and that's part of our space and our location as well. Lastly, my intention today is to continue to have this conversation. This book is something that stood out to me early in my teaching career as something I use in social justice education to get my students thinking about the ways that we have systems in our country. So it's really great to connect with all the folks here in this group. And I am representing the category of the alumni. So I am a two-time alumna of the University of Minnesota here at CLA for undergrad with a degree in arts and then Afro studies. And then in addition to that, my master's degree at the College of Education and Human Development and Multicultural College Teaching and Learning.
Wonderful. Well, welcome everyone. And we want to make completely clear that if you have read the book, that is wonderful. If you have not read the book, that is wonderful as well. So I'm going to get us a little bit situated with the text by explaining, giving you a sense of how Wilkerson is encouraging us to think about caste, and also how she's encouraging us to think about race in the text. And so if you have read the book, then you know that Wilkerson loves a metaphor. So she loves metaphors that involve houses. She loves metaphors of bodies. She loves metaphors of pathogens. And she invokes these different types of metaphors when trying to convey what it is that she's trying to do with caste in this book. She describes the nation as being like an old house that we have inherited. And she writes, and this is on page 17, if you end up reading the book, she writes, like other old houses, America has an unseen skeleton, a caste system that is as central to its operation as are the studs and joists that we cannot see in the physical buildings we called home. Caste is the infrastructure of our divisions. It is the architecture of human hierarchy, the subconscious code of instructions for maintaining, in our case, a 400-year-old social order. Looking at caste is like holding the country's X-ray up to the light. And then she goes on to describe caste as an artificial construction, that it is fixed and embedded in terms of how we rank sort of humanity in terms of its values, and the types of sort of assumptions, and especially the ways in which sort of supremacy gets coded and affixed to certain groups, and then inferiority gets fixed and encoded with other groups. And she's also very clear that as she wants us to think about caste, that it is fundamentally a mechanism for the ways in which power circulates, as well as the ways in which resources circulate. The book engages with three types of caste systems. And so she focuses on Nazi Germany, the millennia-long caste system in India, and then I would say primarily on what she describes as the shape-shifting, unspoken, race-based caste pyramid in the United States. And here is the place where Wilkerson begins to give us a sense of how she wants us to think about caste versus how she wants us to think about race. And so basically she says that in the US context, race does the heavy lifting for the caste system, and that the caste system is invested in this hierarchy of human values and divisions, and race is doing a lot of that work. She uses again this metaphor of like, what's the caste as the skeleton and race as the skin. She's clear that she sees the two as working in tandem, and she later explains on page 19, she says, caste and race are neither synonymous nor mutually exclusive. They can and do coexist in the same culture and serve to reinforce each other. Race in the US is the visible agent of the unseen force of caste. So it's race is the visible, caste is all of that structure that lies beneath, that's interested in how power and resources are circulated and distributed. Race plays it's the place where we sort of see it embodied, but it's not sort of doing the fundamental work. Caste is doing that. Caste is the bones, race is the skin. And she proposes here, and I think this is a question to wrestle with. I think that we've all been wrestling with as we read the book. She proposes that caste is fixed and race is fluid. And she is also really clear about the fact that caste is for many audiences is not going to be a resonant term. And I actually think, part of the reason that she uses the term is because in some ways it's not a resonant term. She spends a lot of time reminding us that a group of largely Black and white scholars, largely social scientists at mid-century, were connecting the US racial system to the Indian caste system. She spends a fair amount of time talking about the connections and solidarities between Indian and African-American activists, both in the sort of their scholarly connections, their activist connections, their physical transnational connections, and sort of building kinship and kinhood and relationship together. At the same time, she leans into caste, and later in the next chapter, she leans into caste. And part of the reason she does so, even after making this sort of case around the strong connections between these movements, largely historically, but also, possibly in this moment that we're living in, I think she also leans into caste because she describes it as having certain types of disorienting features. She suggests that caste helps us to better understand and see what is leading to our collective detriment. And here the origins, our discontents is really the ways in which this creates a discontent that is not only felt by those in the lowest caste, but those in the middle of the caste system, those at the height of the caste system. And so her goal here, I think, is really to do something that encourages a common cause and to help us to sort of summon the courage to vanquish caste if possible. So that is just to give you a little bit of grounding for how Wilkerson is introducing us to these terms, and we'll continue to wrestle with and share with you how in our book club conversations we wrestled with that. But before we jump into that, sort of some of those portions where we get a little bit deeper into parts of the text that we found particularly powerful, and would say, if you have 10 minutes, spend some time with this chapter. It will give you food for thought. And before we get to some of our larger takeaways, right? Because a lot of this book club is, it's about promoting a conversation across the college and across our complicated positionalities in the college. But another part is to think about how we take what we're reading and then find ways to apply and connect it to our sort of personal as well as professional experiences and work. So we felt it was important to tell you a little bit about caste and race. The book, of course, is entitled Caste, but we want to now spend this next bit of a chunk of time walking you through what Wilkerson describes as the 8 pillars of caste. And this is basically a section. The book is broken up into 7 parts. Part 4 is where she describes these 8 pillars. And basically what she has done is she's, in some ways, right, this is a comparative study thinking across Nazi Germany, the Indian caste system, and what she describes as the US caste system, which is largely a system that's built around race. And she has tried to distill what she sees as some of the core elements across these systems. What is that skeleton that is the sort of shared portion across some of these systems? And so each of us are going to speak to a couple of the pillars. I'm going to get us started off. I'll just talk about the first pillar very briefly. This is a very brief chapter. Maybe it's like 4 or 5 pages. The book is lengthy, but when we start making suggestions about chapters, the chapters are brief and really they're interesting and they're easily digestible. So the first pillar that she points us to is divine will and the laws of nature. And here what she is really focusing on is the role that sacred texts, and here she's thinking about ancient Hindu texts as well as Christian, Judeo-Christian, biblical texts and traditions, the role that they play in supporting a hierarchy of human values, the role that they play in supporting notions that there are people sort of at the top of the system, at the head of the system, at the feet, at the base of the system. They open up space, to validate enslavement in certain of their contexts. And they also sort of open the doors to thinking about the ways that, humanity participates through these traditions sort of in a debasement and in the production of hierarchy. And so this is the first pillar. I'm going to hand it off to one of my book club colleagues, and they are going to take you through some of the next couple of pillars. And thank you so much. I'm not sure who I'm handing it to for heritability.
It's me. So pillar 2 is heritability. And what Wilkerson is talking about here is how caste systems really rely on ascribing rank and role at birth. And that this is really supposed to be immutable and fixed throughout life. It's a way to kind of lock people in and ensure the perpetuation of the caste system because it can't shift. And I think one of the things that's really important here, Melinda's really talked about how race and caste fit together in Wilkerson's work. And I think this is one of the spots where we can see her addressing class as well. She makes the important point that if you can act your way out of it, then it's class, not caste. So there's class mobility, but that doesn't mean a caste will change. And so when she talks about some of the examples, one of the things that comes up is how even individuals who've managed to really climb a class ladder will still experience the consequences of their place in the caste system in sometimes really violent and brutal ways, but also very subtle ways sometimes too. And also in this section, she's talking about the US context and how this principle of the heritability of caste mapped into the reproduction of slavery. That in the US, there was a break with English common law where children inherited the status of their father. And in the United States, this switched to inheritance of the status of the mother to perpetuate slavery through rape and other forms of brutality. So that African Americans as the lowest caste, that slaves would stay at the bottom, even as white masters found ways to expand their slave population. So this really brutal version of what the heritability of caste meant in the United States. So I'll hand it off now for pillar 3.
Thank you, Laura. So the pillar 3, I think, is really strongly tied with pillar 2. In terms of what Laura was talking about, the 1662 Virginia Assembly status of the mother decision, which again did deviate from English common law. That was really intentional by the original folks that were on this land to start designating the difference between marriage and mating, who could get away with what and for what purposes in terms of exploitation. In addition to this, as Laura kind of noted, this opened the door for violent sexual assaults against enslaved African women. So much so that we saw when the slave trade ended in 1808, that we still had the enslaved population grow by over 2 million from that time until emancipation. So controlling who could mate with who in this term and who could marry who, again, ties back to class status, but also made these really distinctions, these big distinctions within our society about who was valuable and who was not considered that way. And also prohibiting interracial marriage. And we noted that interracial marriage was something that was just something recent, 55 years ago, with the Loving v. Virginia decision that essentially made it legal for people to racially intermarry. And that was in 1967, but that also was not it. So as of 2000, Alabama did not actually completely dissolve their laws regarding interracial marriage until 2000, the year 2000. And even then, 40% of the electorate voted to try to keep those laws prohibiting interracial marriage. So this is not something that is new news. It's something that, again, that has been firmly established. And one thing I do like about Wilkerson and her methods through the book is that she's connecting it through history. So we see how time has established these practices, and we are seeing it show up in society today. So I think, again, tying a little bit with heritability, but really controlling who could marry who, and then again creating these systems of legacy through child and continued generations in their family. So from there, I think we are moving on to pillar 4 regarding purity, which I go back to Laura for that one.
Thanks. Yes. And so we've got, Stephanie's talking about with interracial marriage and these legal restrictions. I think where purity and pollution kind of bridges out of that is that in addition to these legal and sort of formal mechanisms, this pillar of purity and pollution really gets at how there's also these social and cultural messages and rituals that reinforce separation. So purity is ascribed to the dominant caste in this caste system, and individuals in that dominant caste are taught to fear pollution from the lower castes. And so this becomes a mechanism for maintaining separation in ways that go beyond what marriage and heritability do, that this sort of creates a more systemic level within other kinds of interaction. That we see this with just really extreme forms of segregation and isolation of castes. And in the US context, this really plays out powerfully with the concept of separate but equal. And so she talks about the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, and how this formal separation functions to isolate castes. And in the US, this functions as a 2-tier system. One of the things she really gets into in this chapter, though, is that whiteness is also in flux, and that it's not a stable category. And this goes back to what Melinda was saying at the beginning as well about how race and caste interface, particularly in the US context. And so she describes these middle caste efforts to get under the white tent. And so we see this with immigration from parts of Europe, and how different groups are kind of trying to get into this higher caste status because the alternative is to get lumped in with lower caste. And one of the things I think this chapter really does a good job of is getting at the absurdity and artificiality of caste categories, because who gets to be counted as white keeps changing over time to maintain power. And so when I think about this chapter, I also think about the tensions and connections with the heritability pillar, particularly because there's some disorienting features here. You've got what's supposed to be sort of natural and inherited, but that also has to be produced. And that even as it's supposed to be based on birth, based on marriage, these categories have to keep shifting to maintain the caste system. And so it shows us how caste is really cobbled together out of inconsistencies and contradiction to keep that hierarchy in place, and that the rules are constantly changing. And again, this goes back to what Melinda said earlier on as well about caste being fixed, but race being fluid, and how the idea that this group is pure and this group is polluting, and we need to keep these groups apart, maps onto, at the same time, not even having stable clarity about what the groups are. And now we'll turn to Melinda with occupational hierarchy.
Thank you. Yeah, so the 5th pillar is occupational hierarchy, the jatis, and the mudsill. And so in the US context, the mudsill refers to the foundational sill plate that runs along the base of a house and bears its weight. As I mentioned, Wilkerson loves a metaphor that is of the house or of the body. And so this is one that she returns to, but it's also one that has a really sort of long history in terms of thinking about class and capitalism, the economic system within the United States, and sort of who is that sort of base of workers that is at the foundation of building a nation, and then what is the weight that is borne by them, by that house. Like, so regal house, but the weight is being disproportionately borne by the mudsill. In the Indian caste context, the jati or subcaste, and here I'm just going to quote, or it's a subcaste to which a person was born, established the occupation of their family, that their family fulfilled, from cleaners of latrines to priests in the temples. Those born to families who collected refuse or tanned the hides of animals or handled the dead were seen as the most polluted and the lowest in the hierarchy, untouchable due to the dreaded and thankless, though necessary task they were presumably born to fulfill. And so here again is a place where Wilkerson is making lots of parallels, in this case, between the jati and the mudsill. And here she's defining the mudsill largely as African Americans who, through enslavement, sort of bore the weight of building the nation, not being remunerated for it, but rather being terrorized and violated throughout that whole process. But then also thinking in the period after emancipation, the ways in which, similar to the ways in which one is sort of born into their economic place in society, that African Americans frequently also were responsible for the dirtiest, most demeaning, least desirable jobs. And I would say, just in the same way that my book club colleagues have mentioned here, you also do see that overlap, right? So doing the dirtiest work then manages to help to also support the fourth pillar, right? Because that association, it is an association that means that you're not going to be able to enjoy certain types of purity because of your proximity sort of to dirt and to danger and to the sort of least valued, even if one's work is fundamentally the work that makes, right? It's the work that allows the house to sit, to be a habitable structure. At the same time, what she does in this chapter is thinks about the ways in which first, right, through in the United States, through the laws of enslavement, that necessarily was a legal structure that was upholding the occupational hierarchy and segregation. She spends a fair amount of time talking about that, how also in the post-emancipation period, African Americans were still frequently relegated to very specific jobs. It's really not until we get up until the mid-20th century, largely with the civil rights and Black Power movements, that we begin to be able to see African Americans move into different sort of places within our labor force and labor market. The other thing that she points to here, which is, I think, really interesting, and it appears at the end of the chapter, she really makes the point that central to this hierarchy, a part of the hierarchy is literally about the labor that's being performed. But she also talks about how undergirding this pillar is always a required sort of performance of subservience. And here she engages with especially some of the historical literature around enslavement and the ways in which slaves were sort of were required always to be performing, right? So you might literally be feeling broken and disheartened. And here she describes the example of the coffle. The coffle was this experience of at the end of the transatlantic slave trade, where we said, well, we're no longer going to be importing slaves. There was an internal slave trade where enslaved peoples moved largely from the upper South to the lower South. So, and in the midst of that slave trade, that is the experience where many families are being sort of torn apart, broken apart in this separation and forced migration. At the same time, people that were in the coffle, that were taking this 1,000-mile walk to a slave market, possibly in New Orleans or someplace along that path, were frequently required to sing and to dance and to be jovial. And so she's really interested in also the performative value that was required even as one is also performing sort of subservience, one also has to perform a certain type of joy in one's lower caste position. And so a fascinating pillar intersects with several of the others, and I will hand it off to the next pillar, which is around dehumanization and stigma.
Okay, thank you. And just to note, I do see that someone popped in a question. We have a section near the end, and so you can populate the Q&A section here, and just note that we'll get to those near the end of our time today together. And so you can continue to populate the Q&A, and we will move that to the end and respond to those at the end. So thank you for engaging and then adding those questions there. I'm going to continue with pillar number 6 and 7. And I think 6, like many of these, start to connect with some of these other pillars in the method of dehumanization and stigma. And part of that, Melinda was just talking about this, like performative joy that people have in terms of having to do certain things in order to make other people feel better about the position that they put them in. And that ties to dehumanization. Really, Wilkerson talks about this early on in this section about the weaponization of individualism versus the monolith mentality. So individualism is something that's granted to people in higher castes to have a space where they are unique. They bring attributes to their society through their wealth, through their personality, their humor, their cooking skills, all these different things, right? We had people who were enslaved, who were doctors, people who were caregivers, people who were mothers, daughters, they all had this identity. The method of dehumanization really erases that. It creates this monolith where every single person is the same, and every person within that group deserves that level of inhumanity subjected on them. So methods that she brought up that I think were really powerful in terms of majority Jewish folks during the Holocaust, and those who were enslaved here in the United States, were reduced calories. So there was a calorie deficit that was given, where some of the cruelest things were people having to work in the bakeries and the kitchens, but knowing that they were starving. And if they were going to eat any of that food, then there would be harsh punishment. That's a method of dehumanization, knowing that that is a natural survival part of our being, is to feed ourselves and have enough food to actually allow people less than what they need to do more labor than a body should be doing for 18 plus hours a day, and then punishing people if they were to, find different ways of feeding themselves, either through farming or hunting the rats that were in, the bunkers and all these different things. So the other thing that Wilkerson talks about in terms of the methods of dehumanization related to purposeful dehumanization was shameful uniforms. So giving people clothing that was decidedly not meant for clothing. So really rough textures, things that you would have for food storage and things like that in the past. This is the type of cloth that people were given. During the Holocaust, they were given striped uniforms. So that uniformity, again, works for the monolith mentality, so that if you are harming or injuring or killing one person, it doesn't matter because they're the same as the next person to them. This also tied with shaving people's heads, really starving them so they were just bones. Walking people were just like walking skeletons, the fact that they were so malnourished. And then again, the public showcasing that she talks about too, it relates to what Melinda was just talking about, this kind of performative joy, where people who were on the slave auction blocks were required to smile and stand there and be allowed to be examined in front of people, manhandled, poorly handled on these spaces, examined openly, just naked bodies, and then also be okay with it. If they were to fight back, then they would get beaten. And so also that introduced more dehumanization. But when people are considered this one group, again, you remove that, their individual identities, their attributes that they bring, and then you tie that to one person being subjected, means that it's intentional and it doesn't matter because they're the same as the next person, or the person in front of them, the person behind them. They're all one person. So individualism really stood out to me because I know in the United States, it's also a big issue when you think about individualism and this really need to be an individual. I think a lot of people don't even like to be categorized as a millennial or Gen Z or Gen X. We still have this drive to be our own person. But again, dehumanization through caste systems and history remove that ability for people who are in lower castes. In terms of number 7, I will move on to that pillar, terror as enforcement, cruelty as a means of control. One of the things that stood out, and this was on page, actually, I don't know the page right now because I thought I wrote it down, but I didn't. But there's a quote in that section where she says, "Evil asks little of the dominant caste other than to sit back and do nothing." We know that there are extremists that are out there that have done great terror in this world. In an earlier section, which I'll get to in a little bit later in our presentation, she was noting that there was just a handful, a couple dozen Nazis that sat in a room and created these arbitrary structures of identity. So making sure that they knew what category to place people who were actually considered Jewish, and they used their grandparentage, again, tying into heritability, to make that determination whether someone was Jewish enough to commit them to the crimes of the Holocaust. And again, making these arbitrary structures that really had no relevance, they were using these to do that. Again, a small group of people in a room making a decision that impacted millions of people. And the same thing is that other people saw this happening. They saw this and they were observing the shifts in the society, the shifts in government, and the terror that was happening. Again, through dehumanization, they sort of made peace with that. So terror as enforcement, cruelty as a means of control means that the majority can just sit back, and particularly if you're in the dominant caste, sit back and do nothing. And so I think in terms of contemporary times, I think about that with January 6th, right? We have this huge insurrection. We have actions of a couple thousand people at the Capitol, but how that stemmed from all these other people kind of, enforcing these beliefs, these conspiracy theories, millions of people that are part of various different groups such as QAnon or, various alt-right groups. There are like thousands of people in the country that were not there at the insurrection that supported that and sat back as that, happened within our nation. And we were on the front and center internationally for our capital being subjected to an insurrection. I also think about that locally in terms of George Floyd, right? We saw people that were part of the lower caste system around and surrounding George Floyd as this was happening, and people in the upper class, Derek Chauvin and these other folks with power in terms of their positionality related to policing, letting him basically commit this terror and this murder, and then someone was able to capture it on video. Yet following that, we saw all this response and all these protests. But again, all that led up to that moment, people were sitting back and not saying this after we've had multiple murders and deaths in Minnesota, particularly of Black men. And so again, sitting back led up to that kind of allowance and that expectation where Derek Chauvin would have that level of power with George Floyd, resulting in his murder. So terror as an enforcement, cruelty as a means of control is not only historical, it's very contemporary. We see those impacts kind of doing a full circle, being deeply embedded from the beginning and now resulting in manifesting even in modern times. From there, I'll go ahead and shift to Isha, who will be talking about inherent superiority versus inherent inferiority.
Thanks, Stephanie, Melinda, and Laura. So the 8th and final pillar in Wilkerson's book, which is inherent superiority versus inherent inferiority, is actually tying into all the other pillars that Wilkerson has talked about. And essentially at the core of the argument is the understanding that historically and even in contemporary times, dominant castes have been in a relationship of inherent, assumed, unquestioned superiority over the subordinate castes, who are deemed to have lower intellect, talent, wealth, and so on. And subordinate castes by no means could move up the ladder. And while Wilkerson has talked about caste mobility in other parts of the book, which my colleagues have mentioned, the basic understanding here is that this caste system benefits from and is reproduced by actually reproducing this relationship of superiority and inferiority, which is not anything based on skills or education level or anything, any other known factor, but basically a question that is just assumed unquestioned by virtue of one's birth. And the examples Wilkerson cites here are tying into the arguments Wilkerson has made in other previous chapters of the book, but also are largely centered once again around the Jim Crow era, questions around segregation, how segregation was enforced, and the whole question of social codes that arise out of it. So an example, for instance, Wilkerson cites on page 163, which is familiar to most of us, is unlike dominant caste passengers who climbed aboard, paid their bus fare and took a seat, Black passengers had to climb up, pay their fare, then get off the bus so as not to pollute or disturb the white section by walking through it. And there are a range of other excerpts and examples and some scholarship, historical and anthropological, that Wilkerson is citing to tie in this argument and make this argument about how superiority versus inferiority is assumed, it's rationalized through this system, it's reproduced, and the basic premise here that Wilkerson emphasizes is that there is therefore a relationship of subordination and servility that has been historically built and is also being reproduced. So in the contemporary context, I could think of racial segregation in labor markets. One could, if one was to look at the United States context, one could look at questions around cleaning staff and their racial composition, and including also a lot, including cleaning staff at the U happen to be immigrant workers. Likewise, in the Indian context, there is an obvious caste dimension to sanitation work. If we take together these 8 pillars of caste, it actually leads us to a very critical question. That is, if we take together these 8 pillars and the various characteristics that Wilkerson has outlined of the caste system, what does and Melinda spoke about how Wilkerson likes using metaphors. The question then is for all of us to consider is what does seeing caste and race in the same frame mean? What does it mean intellectually and politically? And a deeper question of, is caste therefore a metaphor? To address this question, to which I don't have any easy answers, the first acknowledgement is that we have to understand that at the heart of Wilkerson's argument is this equation of race and caste, and the understanding that racialization in the United States is a form of what Wilkerson says, a hidden form of caste system, an unseen skeleton. In the same way, Wilkerson also compares caste to grammar, which is a shorthand for what Wilkerson says, assigning of assumptions and values to physical features. And she exemplifies this in the 8 pillars of caste, the various codes of conduct that are enforced, the assumptions around this, and the way these are sustained and reproduced. What Wilkerson argues is that caste is the infrastructure that holds each group in its place. Now, as someone from the Indian context who's been exposed to the realities of the caste system, but also as someone who I acknowledge I hail from the upper caste, the historically oppressor caste, the critical question and the interconnections between race and caste have been a long-standing academic debate, and I don't have the space to go into the depth into all of that. But there are 2 critical questions that arise out of this reading of, one is obviously bound to ask, why is Wilkerson equating caste to race or race to caste? And what does this kind of bringing caste and race together in the same frame imply for us? And I notice, Paulomi, you have a question in the chat about what does it mean for pedagogy? And I'm going to get to that shortly. There is this very critical question wherein on a reading of the text, Wilkerson speaks about being at an academic conference at UMass Amherst, where Wilkerson realized that caste is a better explanatory term than race. But reading the book, one still wonders why. And I'm going to use this part of our book club presentation to raise some of those questions. So the first question is, when Wilkerson is making using these metaphors of skeleton, grammar, infrastructure, one actually wonders that how is it different from the explanations of race as a social construct that we speak about widely in scholarship, in our classes, and so on. And what does adding this caste lens to race and racialization enable? In this discussion, Wilkerson is also alluding to other scholars of race and caste, and most importantly, a discussion between Ambedkar and Du Bois. And Wilkerson cites from Du Bois saying, why did God make me a stranger and an outcast in my own house? And Wilkerson also argues that caste is rigid, is fixed, it's rigid, while race is fluid and superficial, something that can also be problematized and contested, because scholarship from the Indian context tells us that there are intersections, and it's also borrowing from critical race theory in the United States, that there are axes of discrimination that are intersectional. So in effect, caste and class may intersect to enable certain forms of caste mobility, class mobility. And there is also scholarship that has argued about the varied ways in which caste and gender work across different spatial contexts. So caste may not be so pronounced in a large metropolitan context, like the city of Delhi, from where I come from, versus a rural context wherein the markers of segregation, the practices of caste may be far more pronounced. So I think first there is the first question is that purely acknowledging this caste lens does away with other intersectional forms of discrimination, not only from the comparative context in which Wilkerson is using the term caste from, but also other questions, but also intersectional discrimination in the context of the United States. The other question from a point of comparative, and one wonders about her comparative methodology, because Wilkerson does little to explain what is the argument for using the three contexts of India, Nazi Germany, and United States. And while Wilkerson talks about how Nazi Germany borrowed from the Jim Crow, there is also the other deeper question, which came to my mind, was why does Wilkerson exclude a context like, say, apartheid South Africa, which has very deep parallels and very persistent questions of racialization, even in the post-apartheid era. And in a brief summary, I would say that while Wilkerson recognizes these distinctions between caste and race, it's not dealt in the depth that scholars of caste and race have alluded to. And to be more generous to the author, one also understands that this is a journalistic account written for a public audience and not necessarily a scholarly audience. So therefore, there is a question that we must also engage with as to what does a general audience reading this book take away that not necessarily a scholarly audience may read. And it is here that I think there are important, that despite these conceptual distinctions, these empirical questions that I feel Wilkerson are the lackings for me in this text, there are very important political questions that this text raises. And I'd like to begin this part of the discussion by going back to a very important discussion that was raised at the 2009 Durban Review Conference, the World Conference Against Racism, wherein India voted against the inclusion of caste as a subcategory of racism. And the arguments being made were that caste does not have obvious physical characteristics like race, and caste is unique to the Indian context, and that the Indian government is doing everything to combat caste discrimination. Now, this is a similar argument that Wilkerson does note in terms of the distinctions, that while race has obvious physical characteristics, caste doesn't necessarily have that, and that there are more tacit ways through which caste is recognized, and these being surnames or the occupation one is engaged with, the most obvious parallels being sanitation work in India. But I would borrow from the work of Dalit scholars here, and also feminist scholar Nivedita Menon, who actually wrote in the context of the 2009 review conference that despite these being conceptually different categories, despite there being varied empirical realities and contextual realities, Nivedita Menon argued in 2011, in the backdrop of this whole caste race debate in the backdrop of the Durban conference, and way before Wilkerson's text came out, that using these two together is a creative political strategy, in the sense that it allows for questions of global translation from different local contexts, and it allows for questions of transnational solidarities and common causes to emerge, something Melinda touched upon in her closing remarks. And there is also an argument to be made, and this actually ties to the question in the chat on pedagogy. There's a very interesting excerpt Nivedita Menon notes in this article, wherein a European student in one of Nivedita Menon's classes states that given a hesitation to critique non-Western systems, it is very difficult to critique caste as someone who is acquainted to other forms of non-Western discrimination, but is not so well acquainted with non-Western forms of discrimination. And also around an entire critique of Eurocentrism, there is a reluctance, and therefore what this enables is to provide a common language to understand questions of oppression, power, and marginalization. And this is also something that has been argued by Dalit intellectual Suraj Yende, who says that caste is not only an Indian phenomenon, and what Wilkerson's book allows us to do is to pay attention to systems of oppression and marginalization that have and to enable a generative discussion that can subvert hegemonic tropes across the world, and in the American context, challenging white supremacy, but this can be extended to challenging caste, especially Hindutva supremacy in the Indian context, and so on. And finally, there is this argument that even though the conceptual and empirical treatment of caste may suffer in favor of an American audience, which is an argument another Dalit scholar, Yashika Dutt, has made. There is an argument to be made in political terms for putting these two at par and for invoking some generative conversations on what does it mean for challenging systems of oppression and for bringing voices of oppression together. And I will end this with a question which can allow us to move on to the next part of the discussion, which is that bringing race and caste together from an intellectual but also political standpoint, what does it mean for understanding the politics of our own institutions as academics who inherit university spaces under challenging pressures of neoliberal capitalism, and to the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion within our institutions? And I open the floor to my colleagues for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Isha. It was such a comprehensive review of different positionalities in relationship to the book. So thank you for adding us, giving us more to think about in terms of beyond just the US context, and even bringing in how the parallels of South Africa show up in the space and could have been connected to parts of it. So much appreciated. With this, I'm going to transition to our next part of our webinar and discussion, where each of the book club members will just kind of highlight briefly highlight just parts of the book that we thought were important to stand out in relationship to either our roles or what we're doing or what we personally connected with, just to give the folks that are here and just the opportunity to think about if you're going to go dive into a section, this might be an area to check out. So I start because my chapters just show up earlier in the book. One is chapter 8. And so chapter 8 really touches on, again, kind of what I spoke to earlier about these arbitrary constructions that were created by the Nazis in order to designate who is going to be doing or who was going to be subjected to what during the Holocaust. And this is a chapter that I introduced to my students at Inver Hills Community College when teaching social justice, mostly for them to think about the framing of our nation and the role of our history in impacting other areas, other countries, other nations, other groups. And so it's really important to think about them using the United States as inspiration for what they were trying to calculate in terms of racial hygiene, as they put it. Racial hygiene, it sounds so gross. When I think about like racial cleansing, but they took a lot from various eugenicists in the United States who had developed these systems about who should be considered human and who should be considered subhuman, while also maintaining robust innocence. That's something that Hitler quoted, that the United States has robust innocence while still, committing massive crimes to both Native American folks and enslaved Black people in this country. Yet we are often known for this concept of, all men are created equal. These are words that were put and people blast them everywhere, where our country has this concept of liberty and freedom and justice for all. That never really played out the way the words were written. And that's something that the Nazis really wanted to balance in terms of their massive amounts of inhumanity and genocide, and then also still having this picture in the world of being good and liberating in this nation worthy of honor, while also subjecting millions of people to genocide. And so chapter 8 really inspired a lot for me because it kind of put a mirror up to the United States, and I try to share that with my students so they can start thinking about the way that we have socialized the goodness of the United States, and also how that shows up in a lot of context towards critical race theory in our schools and systems today. The other chapter that I like to bring up, and I'm again trying to be brief, but the chapter 12 about scapegoats, this is also really powerful to me when I was able to connect it to various behaviors and actions at the University of Minnesota. So scapegoats, and I have a little bookmark here where I'll try to be brief and maybe get to it, maybe not. But one of the quotes on page 192, it says, "The Negro becomes a scapegoat, an object and an object lesson for his group." And so this we see carry out a lot in history. And there was a situation that happened several years back with the St. Kate's campus, where a white man decided to create a scapegoat of a Black man that didn't exist. So a white man who was the security officer brought his gun to work and shot himself. And instead of taking in credit and responsibility of his own actions, he blamed a non-existent Black man with a short afro in a Black hoodie. And so St. Kate's also has this historical connection of being a women's school and our United States context about protecting white women. And so as a predominantly white institution, there's also this racial interplay of who we're protecting against whom. And in this case, this security guard tied in multiple stereotypes to emphasize the truth of his scapegoat, which again, this person did not exist, but saying that they were caught on campus smoking marijuana and then turned around and shot the security guard and ran off. They brought in several officers, I think about 50 officers, to do a search of the campus, including dogs. So thousands of dollars in resources were put into this search for a person that didn't exist. And so when she talks about scapegoating, we see real life examples of this happening locally. We also have this issue with UMPD, which I won't get into now because we don't have time. But I think those two chapters really stood out to me in the way again, this dehumanization manifests in different ways. The way that through putting someone in this caste system related to race starts to really allow for doors to be open to kind of perpetuate the same belief in inferiority, violence, and all these other categories that are really derogatory. With that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Melinda so she can talk about the sections that stood out to her.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephanie. So in the book club conversations, I felt like we really wrestled with different pieces of the text. And when I was trying to think about what would I tell people to read, what would I tell them to focus on, I will just say, and these are all going to connect because my thinking about the text has evolved from the conversations and then really sort of like up to the day of having our conversation today. So the first thing that I would point you to, and we spent a lot of time going through the pillars, so I'm not gonna say too much about them, but I think if you were having to make a choice, that pillar section that we went through is actually just 60 pages of this 400-page book. And so I think it's really, really incredibly powerful. And I think it gets back to a lot of Isha's points about like what might be the sort of useful pieces here, whether we call it like, whether we're deeply invested in the sort of like lexicon of, like caste or race and, that complicated conversation. What is it maybe in those pillars that could be really useful? I'm saying this because when we met and had some of our conversations, one of the things that I brought to that conversation was the way I really wrestled with how where the pillars were situated in the text, and then everything that came after. So they're the pillars, and then I thought I was going to be reading a different book. I thought I was going to be reading a book where now Wilkerson we're going to like method, with some sort of in some methodological way, we're now going to really think about how it is that we sort of like deconstruct or vanquish any one of these pillars. That is not at all what follows. And I think as we walk through some of the chapters that we're pointing to, it will be clear that that is not how the book works or functions. And my first response to that was, I found it, for me, it was troubling and jarring. But the nice thing about the book club is you go back and you have conversations and then you're able to rethink things. And so the two chapters that I would point people to, I'll just speak so briefly to them, are chapter 11, which is called Dominant Group Status Threat and the Precarity of the Highest Rung. And my other chapter is chapter 14, The Intrusion of Caste in Everyday Life. Now, the reason I wanted to lead with the pillars is because I think you should all read the pillars. But what I wanted to say about these two chapters is, as I was looking at them again, I think really what is sort of interesting and powerful about this book is that each chapter offers the opportunity to go back and really think about the ways in which the pillars are at work in these different situations. And I mean, I think one of the places that I've come to in terms of my wrestling with this book is that, going back to Wilkerson and her metaphors, she loves a metaphor, but she loves metaphors, especially the home, especially the body. She really loves systems because she wants to be clear that the skeleton, right? The skeleton is with all of these different movable parts. And so as I was thinking about these chapters, and I chose them, largely the dominant status, the chapter 11 on dominant group status threat is really very much about sort of the precarity of the white working class, especially in the moment after the civil rights movement, after the sort of unwinding of a lot of the work of the labor movement in the context of globalization. It is really it's a chapter that is very much about their precarity. And the piece that I would lift up is she has a quote that she says on 183. She says, "What a caste system does is it makes everyone within it a captive. So for me, this is very much, and she cites a lot of literature that sort of is literally thinking about how she cites a book that's about it's about dying for whiteness, but she's really interested in, in like health statistics and what mortality rate is looking like among white populations, and the ways in which literally we are seeing changes in mortality for whites who are in this, really sort of precarious system in terms of their positionality, and sort of what does it mean as the dominant group to have one's status threatened, but also when remains so attached to those, what are the consequences, right? So for her, the discontents, the our discontents, she really is like the our. And in the US context, the our is very much about sort of thinking about the ways in which whites also are captive in this space. But as I was rereading this chapter and the next chapter, what was really powerful to me is that it sort of worked almost like now thinking back, like a kind of a jigsaw pedagogical assignment. Because as I was reading it, I was like, oh, you know what's at work here? The occupational hierarchy, that's at work in part of this story. But it's actually not just that, it's also the one about inherent superiority. Also, there's the piece about dehumanization and stigma. And so in both of these chapters, there is this opportunity to really think about the ways in which the skeleton comes together and operates in these different spaces. For chapter 14, which again, it's a really, really interesting chapter. It's the intrusion of caste in everyday life. This is the one where I really focused on, you could really see the pillars of heritability, as well as terror and enforcement. And so the pillars, now on a second reflection, because it takes me a while, I'm beginning to sort of think about the way the chapters become sort of case studies for thinking about the pillars in different ways. The only quote that I'll uplift from that chapter is one that happens at the very end, because this one is focused much more on sort of the power of surveillance for lower caste communities. And one thing that she talks about is she talks about the thievery of caste, that it steals time, it steals psychic resources from the marginalized, it drains energy in any uphill competition, in an already uphill competition. So those are the two places I would point you to, and I will pass it on to Laura to share a little bit of her thinking about the text.
So Melinda, I really appreciate what you were saying about how these chapters kind of build on each other, interact with each other, because one of the things that came up as I was thinking about the sections that I'd really recommend, which are in the part 5, the consequences of caste, chapters 20, the inevitable narcissism of caste, 22, the Stockholm syndrome and survival of subordinate caste, and 24, cortisol, telomeres, and the lethality of caste, is that these are all kind of circling back again, even to the costs that you were describing just now in these earlier chapters. And so we keep getting these new windows, these new lenses, these new ways of bringing our thinking about caste to a new level. And I think that one of the things that's really powerful about these chapters is that they really lay out the harms experienced by people at every level of the caste system on another level, and kind of build on what Melinda was describing, and where we can see what there's a common cause, there's a common need to dismantle this system. And these chapters spoke to me for how they kind of encourage us to confront, for me individually, to confront my own dominant caste status and how it manifests in my own behavior. So these chapters may be especially powerful and relevant for folks in dominant caste, to kind of think about how to disrupt participation and complicity, because it's so often, as Wilkerson talks about in these chapters, invisible and automatic, that it's this just sort of programmed element. It's in the air we breathe collectively. And there's this pressure for all of us as members of this society to participate in certain ways that are often harmful, both to each other and to ourselves. And so I think this is where we get a really robust picture of some of the costs of caste. And when I think about why this is important, I won't go into the details because I want to save time for discussion, but what happens when dominant caste folks invested in the system start to see it as something to disinvest in? There's power in that. there's an opportunity there. And so I think this is one of the spaces where these chapters where we can see some of the ways that caste works and manifests in daily life, and how individuals of all castes are pressured to participate and perform. And so these chapters may be opportunities to sort of explore how to, why it's important to combat that privilege to do nothing for members of upper caste. And this gets back to what Stephanie was considering with talking about January 6th and allowing, continued police brutality and murder of people of color, that what happens when we start to question that privilege to do nothing and reject it. And I think there was a question about pedagogy in the chat that I'll just quickly touch on, because I think these chapters get at where we may see resistance to the reading, that it's really uncomfortable, I think, for, high caste individuals to read this because it's saying these are things you've been doing that you probably aren't even aware of, and that there's a need to act differently. And I think that, there's a lot of that can really bring up a lot of discomfort and fragility, but that there's a really important need to directly address this and confront that, to sort of move forward in how we treat, and how we treat each other in the society, how we work collectively to dismantle caste.
Thank you, Stephanie, Laura, and Melinda. In the interest of time and to open up for Q&A, I'll keep my comments really brief. And what particularly spoke to me, particularly also as someone from the upper caste, is a section on radical empathy, which Wilkerson speaks about in the epilogue. And I think that is a very critical section, even though I do have some critiques of it, which I'll not go into detail. But Wilkerson makes this distinction between empathy and sympathy, and says that while empathy is about putting yourself in another's shoes and understanding their worldviews and perspectives and how they feel, what dismantling systems of oppression requires is also a little more than empathy. And the term Wilkerson uses is radical empathy. And I quote, "Radical empathy means putting in the work to educate oneself and to listen with a humble heart to understand another's experience from their perspective, not as we imagine would feel. Radical empathy is not about you and what you think you would do in a situation you've never been in and perhaps never will. It is the kindred connection from a place of deep knowing that opens your spirit to the pain of another as they perceive it. The price of privilege is the moral duty to act when one sees another person treated unfairly," unquote. And here Wilkerson is also speaking about, there is a slightly romanticized view also of seeing the humanity in each other, and Wilkerson builds this on from a conversation Wilkerson is having with a plumber in her basement for some repair work, and how the connection happens at a more human level of loss and grief rather than political, because there are no shared political similarities in the first place between the plumber and Wilkerson. And so while one could critique that this view as also being overtly romantic, I think one could pose the question and reframe the point of radical empathy from humanist perspectives and as from critical humanist perspectives, but also from institutional perspectives, to ask that what does radical empathy mean? What does deploying this kind of a lens mean for our own work as engaged scholars, as scholar activists, as individuals inhabiting these institutions that are structured by hierarchical norms, but also individuals who are committed to research and engage scholarship on aspects of social justice. So what does deploying a radical empathy mean for questions of scholarship, teaching, and so on? And therefore, what does it also mean for the way we produce knowledge? So, and here I would like to point to the work of feminist and decolonial scholars who have been talking about moving beyond the privileged place peer-reviewed academic texts hold to more to other forms of public engagement, including which don't get factored into our usual modes of production in the university because of the privilege and hierarchy we give to academic texts. And herein, there is also the related question of collaborating not just with fellow academics, but also with communities that we work with, we engage with, and for causes of social justice that one is talking about. And the related question of whom are we producing knowledge and who is producing that knowledge. And I'm going to pause at that and hand over to my colleagues.
Thank you to each of you for sharing those really strong parts of the book that stood out to you and sharing a little bit about some key takeaways that hopefully folks that are with us can also take away when they're reading the text. From here, we're just going to have Melinda and Laura speak to some of the institutional context. Part of the book club is to have some takeaways that it can apply to an institutional context and ways that we can implement the work, how we can take the text and move it into practice. That's part of the Transformational Conversation Book Club series. It's not just reading the book and having these conversations, but moving it forward in our everyday life. So I will open it up for Melinda and Laura to speak to that. And either one of you can go first. Yeah, I'll let you two choose.
I'll go first? Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. And actually, I think the place that I'm going to start is with Isha's comments about radical empathy, because I know in those book club conversations, I was like, radical empathy, I'm so skeptical. She's quoting like Gunnar Myrdal, and it's like a hearts and minds approach. Or, in some ways it's really like it's a hearts approach. Though of course, like she's wants us to have our hearts also sort of understand, right, all of those skeletal structures that wanted to do a different type of work. So I will say that even that I think my tendency is to bring that skepticism. At the same time, in the work that I am doing now as Associate Dean, and especially thinking about the work in the shared equity leadership space, it is part of that work is about being committed to an entirely different set of values, right? So I think, right, one of Wilkerson's propositions is that caste is about the circulation of power and resources in directions that largely support and benefit the upper caste, right? That is what the system is meant to do. It's meant to ensure unequal distribution of resources. And so while my first just my gut reaction is the sort of hesitancy towards radical empathy, I actually think that part of the way in which we sort of decenter power and resources, not pretend that there aren't power and resources, right? Because I think the pillars provide us the structure for thinking about the circulation of power and resources. But I think she's sort of calling on radical empathy, maybe something that Martin Luther King would have called the beloved community. What current scholars that are sort of leading in that higher education, institutional, shared equity space are describing as a different set of values. And love and care is actually like at the top. It is, right. It's basically about, it's like mutuality, love and care, humility. It is an entirely different set of values. And I know I've sat in meetings because of the work that we've been doing with Courageous Conversations, which also I would say holds this notion that we actually do need to love each other to be able to care for each other. And I remember going to a Dean's Group meeting and sort of reflecting briefly. I was like, so I opened up Glenn Singleton's book and he said, like, love and care is a part of this work. And when I come to work, maybe we're talking about care. I think we're not talking enough about care. Rarely are we talking about love. And so I think that there are big questions here, especially in institutions where so much of the conversation is around power and resources. What does it mean to bring love and care and center that in the conversation? The other thing I would just say is that in the same way that I described, how I feel like the pillars are useful for just navigating the book, and almost like the book could become like a workbook thinking about essentially sort of like the intersections between the ways in which these pillars are working, but also those intersections are like, they're stealthy and complicated, and they want to keep working in ways that reproduce power and reproduce how resources are distributed. So one thing I do think, sort of just in an institutional context, is that whatever problem we're kind of maybe engaging with in the DEI space, I feel like the book is an invitation to think about those intersecting pillars that are at the core of a challenge, and doing some of that work of the sort of mapping and unpacking. So the book did not unpack in the way I wanted to. I think it is the invitation is to bring the mind into that project that maybe pushes our that sort of heart towards philosophies that center love and care. The last thing I will just say, and this is just to sort of speak to, I mean, Isha did a wonderful job sort of describing some of the tensions around caste and race. I will just say that as an institution, with respect to Indian caste, the University of Minnesota understands that to fall under and be protected by its discrimination policies. And there is a Harvard Law Review article that helps to sort of, I think, helps us understand that, because it falls both, it can fall by race, it also can be sort of captured by religious protections from religious discrimination, as well as protections from discrimination based upon one's national identity. At the same time, that is a certain type of marker, but in the Humphrey School, in Gender, Women's Sexuality Studies, in the English creative writing program, we also have programs and examples where people are very clearly understanding caste as a fundamental to their diversity, equity, and inclusion work in the college. It's not sort of back of the page, protected by discrimination policy. It's front of the page, sending a signal to people who are impacted by caste. And there's a lot of research on the ways in which caste follows the diaspora around, just in the same way that race is following people around in this country, right? Caste is following people around. So I just wanted to point you just sort of specifically to some of the ways the institution is thinking about this. And I will now hand it over to Laura.
Thanks, Melinda. So I think, so my role is in graduate admissions partially, as well as supporting graduate students as they navigate their PhD program in my department. And some of the things that I'm really committed to is how we transform who the institution serves and how, versus its kind of historical role of higher ed in maintaining caste and other hierarchies. And some of the things I'm interested in is how do we bring caste into these discussions within departments about graduate admissions, about who belongs at our institution, about how we welcome people in. And in the admissions context, I think this book raises a lot of questions about, what do we do as we try to diversify graduate admissions, make graduate school more accessible? That's a big push right now. But are we actually serving the students in this push to make graduate admissions more accessible? What happens to students once they are here? And how do existing caste hierarchies manifest in the way students experience our institution, and what can we do better? So those are kind of the big questions for me about, where I see this heading, where I see this in my own work, in my own daily efforts to transform our institution. And, it raises questions for me about, as Melinda was talking about, what happens if love and care become central to the work of training students instead of, this sort of focus on meeting sort of, performing certain kinds of roles within the institution. So I'll leave it at that, but I think there's a lot of questions that this book raises about how we approach training for students, how we think about what it means to admit people to our institution and what happens to them after we're here. I mean, I think Wilkerson describing her experience at an academic conference in India where there's a lot of inequalities in treatment of peers that are from different castes kind of signals that the extension of this is what happens when we bring in students And there are who have additional power differentials in addition to those kinds of caste differentials that manifest between colleagues, that students are at an even different kind of power dynamic that we really need to interrogate and think about as we move forward.
Thank you. Thank you everyone on this book club that really just shared so much from personal experience, from our backgrounds, and really just bringing kind of some heart to this conversation. We are going to take a couple minutes to answer some of the questions in the Q&A. I am sorry if we cannot get to them all, but we do appreciate everyone who posed a question. And I will do a quick one because Dan and Marie just wanted to reference the book. So Melinda, if you can check the Q&A and then respond to Dan regarding the book, that would be great. Other than that, we'll start with just the first person because they asked this pretty early on in our presentation. I'm interested in the reader's sense on how the model minority narratives are deployed by members of the highest caste to support hierarchy and denigrate the lowest caste, and how it relates to US and UK electoral politics. And they said, thinking of Bobby Jindal, Nikki Haley, and Rishi Sunak. And I'm not sure if anybody wants to take a stab at that one.
I'm not sure. I mean, I definitely can't sort of speak to the specificity of those specific contexts. I will say that the book does really prioritize the highest caste and the lowest caste. There are sort of moments where Wilkerson is helping us think about the ways in which the middle class are sort of being deployed, or maybe they're trying to get access to the upper caste. And this is one of those places where she's, sort of engaging with questions of fluidity. I will say that, I mean, the model minority, that theory, I mean, it comes very much out of a project of helping to further subordinate the lower caste. I mean, fundamental to the argument is, right, on the one hand, first of all, collapsing the diversity of that model, which is an incredibly diverse group that has huge disparities that are experienced within that. So part of it is to sort of like speak to, an illusion. And then at the same time, it's a model that is very much used to make the case, especially for the lower caste, to sort of re-enshrine the notion of the inherency of their inferiority. And so I think that this is a book that there is a lot of space, if let's say one was to start with the pillars, to think about the ways in which, and I mean, here, if we're thinking about the model minority largely in terms of Asian American, Southeast Asian populations, I think that there are lots of interesting questions about how they navigate that space. I mean, one of the places of navigation has been especially like right around endogamy, and actually around sort of access to interracial marriage for that population, but not for every part of that population, right? There's still disparities, and the ways in which sort of the different pillars function and circulate through that. So I think it's a space for a lot of sort of, I think, interesting conversation. But my sense is not that Wilkerson she does not take that question on, but I think it's one that I appreciate you asking and for all of us to think about. And we are at time. I will say I do happen to be too long-winded. There are a couple other questions and that we were not able to get to. Some that are also in the chat, and what I would like to do is maybe just ask my my colleagues in the book club. I mean, officially this public presentation ends our book club, but I mean, I'm still associate dean in this office and happy to engage in these questions with you. And my sense is that we can collect some of these and continue to try to engage you with answering some of these questions, not today, but maybe in another type of format. And I won't put any pressure on my book club members now, but I'll ask them afterwards about their sort of willingness and to support me in that effort. Oh, and it sounds like they're all saying.
Yeah. Yeah, so I will go ahead and stop the recording since we'll end it on this note. I just want to, again, extend a big thank you to all the folks that have read the book or read it alongside our group or still have yet to read it, but engaging in this conversation and important work, again, in partnership with Ridges and the Office for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion here at CLA. So it looks like a couple folks are willing to stay a little bit longer after I stop the recording to answer some questions. But I just wanted, again, to extend thanks, and then we'll be around to answer a few more questions after that. But so I'll stop the recording.
But before you stop the recording, I also want to say that this book club is also funded through a faculty-driven grant from the Office for Equity and Diversity. So thank you so much for the grant and for the support. And now we can stop the recording.
Okay, great. All right.